Live via closed-circuit television to over 300,000 viewers in theaters and arenas throughout the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. In this boxing ring, you'll see in a 15-round contest for the heavyweight championship of the world, Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay, called by many the fastest man ever to win the title, defends his title against the greatest knockout artist, the big cat from Houston, Texas, Cleveland Williams.
I'm Michael Daly and I'm the presenter of Making a Difference on 92.5 Phoenix FM and the author of many books.
Ballymun, how I remember it back in the, so I suppose, late 60s.
Ballymun was to be the answer to all the social housing problems.
Dublin itself was a completely different city.
Dublin, I was born in 1955. I was born in Irishtown, but my dad quickly moved from Irishtown to Santry.
And on paper, it was a great concept. It was a brilliant concept, actually. And it was to be the leading way to go in Europe.
A memory of those things in the 60s that now seem like they've been taken into nostalgic moments.
Now, that's notwithstanding that they've been told by the UK, this isn't the way to go.
And the 60s then were, times of music change. There was dramatic change in the 60s.
In atmosphere, clothes, fashion, culture was completely different.
As related today, but I have that hindsight now, but when the Beatles came on the scene in the early 60s, it was like, there's the Beatles, and the Beatles were there in 61, 62, and, out comes, She Loves You, and then it was Rubber Soul, and then it was all this, and growing up hearing this music. And
in the 50s was tenements, poverty, came from the flats. But I do remember, one of the big memories for me was John F. Kennedy coming to Ireland. I was actually in an ambulance.
Then the Americanisation, like that was from Liverpool, but then the Americanisation, coming up, hearing about, I remember particularly John F. Kennedy in 1963. I was 8 years of age.
On the way from Our Lady's Hospital, heading over to Blanchardstown with a diagnosed primary tuberculosis, and the traffic, I remember the guys in the ambulance were giving out. The traffic was all over the place because of John F. Kennedy.
He was coming to Ireland, and I remember being on the Swords Road with a little American flag, waving it. And I can see him as close as I am to you. I can see him. He's all tanned. He's got this sandy coloured hair, and it's an amazing time for Ireland.
It's funny when you think of those times.
We were coming out of the 40s, 50s and into the 60s, and there was nothing. There was no money. There was no work. There was nothing happening in Dublin at that time. And indeed, there was nothing happening in the country.
The music, we were used to listening to the Beatles and Freddie and the Dreamers and Jerry and the Pacemakers and all that kind of stuff. And then like the Beach Boys and like even Frank Sinatra. Like I remember my dad playing Frank Sinatra and listening to that kind of stuff. Their influence and the colour TV came in, and the Honeymooners comedy, sitting there watching there on a Friday night with me ma while my dad was away working in Coventry. it was like, it was sort of beginning to wash over me, that influence of America.
It was more psychedelic, it was colourful, I suppose, and there was a brightness about the whole experience, really, looking back to around 1969 as a child.
First introduction to the knowledge of the D11 runners was about 10, 12 years ago when I was at a conference, and there was a musical artist there that sang, and it very much impressed me with his voice. But I was down looking at some tapes a little bit later, and looking at these tapes, I seen a tape, and it was Joseph and this singer. It was the same guy, and this guy came behind me and said, "Do you think that guy's any good?" I said, "I don't know, I'm just looking at it here." He says, "Well, he's brilliant." And I said, "Is he?" "Yeah." He says, "Yeah, because he's me."
But they were reggae based, very exciting. They were going to be bigger than U2.
A family-based, fingless-based soul band in Dublin.
We Lived in the Sky by George Fitzgerald, Chapter 1, The Flats of Ballymun, Dublin, 1969. The boy watched the fight from behind a huge rock. The swords clashed, the man in the green suit jumped back. It was a fence to the death. Then Robin Hood charged into the duel, holding tight to a smile in the face of terrible danger. A brilliant light burst upon them, blinding the Dark King, while our champion sprung into the air, pinning him to a tree. Little John arrived on a brown horse and picked up the lad from behind the rock. Meanwhile, Robin Hood stripped the king of his cloak, and they rode off into the sunset. Joseph, my twin brother, and I sat on the floor clapping, when our hero saved the day. We stayed there until Ma turned the telly off and the black and white picture decreased to a dot.
The late 1970s saw a major shift on the music front. Homegrown acts were beginning to make a big splash across the water. Interestingly, it was Woody Guthrie's book, Bound for Glory, which would influence a young Dunleary boy to rename his band. The young man was Bob Geldof, and the band was called The Nightlife, a name which Geldof changed to the Boomtown Rats after a gang of children who appear in Woody Guthrie's autobiography. Guthrie had also been an influence on the young Bob Dylan, and by the late 70s there was another rising Dublin band simply called U2. As one book had influenced a Dublin band, in the 90s a Dublin band would be a possible influence of a book called The Commitments, written by Roddy Doyle. That book became the basis of an Alan Parker film. The band was the D11 Runners.
One area that we came out and we punched way above our weight, not just in Dublin, but throughout the country, and some would say throughout Europe and possibly throughout the world. It was the time of U2. It was the time of Aslam. It was the time of creativity and music and bands. And if you remember too, back then, The Commitments put us on. And you also had another band that came out at that time who should have really surpassed them all, and that was the D11 Runners.
The D11 Runners were fronted by the Fitzgerald brothers, George, Joseph and Pat. Now the boys were influenced by the English band UB40, whom they saw performing in Dublin in the National Stadium. In the early 80s, the Fitzgeralds, along with some of their friends, saved up all their wages, bought themselves some musical instruments, and these they would ferry in a shopping trolley to a local school where they practiced. The band also included two girls, Jackie Hewitt and Sandra McGowan. Sandra McGowan, whom one journalist described as a stalwart lady, became a high-profile member of the band the D11 Runners. She was born in the north inner city Dublin in 1968, the only girl in a family of 4 brothers. Like the Fitzgeralds, the family moved to Finglas South in 1973.
And that's a story we'd all love to know, and one that we'd all want to get right behind. So at that time, people seen music as their way out. They seen music as their way to get out and get into the big wide world that was out there. And they seen it as an opportunity to not only show their creative side, but to show all that was good from their communities. And equally, Dublin wasn't big enough for them. It had to be England, Europe and the world.